I found the tent on my second day of trekking across the Ross ice shelf, following the path that Scott's party had taken on their return from the pole. It was not the original, of course, that had been carried away by wind and ice long ago, the canvas shredded by decades of polar storms, the poles snapped by the weight of snowdrifts that had accumulated and melted and frozen again, in cycles that measured time in centuries. But the Antarctic Heritage Trust had erected a replica at the site where the 5 men had spent their final days, a faithful reconstruction of the canvas shelter that had offered no protection against temperatures, that plunged to -40 degrees, that had flapped and rattled in winds, that could strip the skin from exposed flesh in minutes, that had become the last roof these men would ever know. Saw it from a distance first, a small dark shape against the white wilderness, and I stopped walking for a moment, letting the silence settle around me like snow, feeling something in my chest that I could not yet name. I had flown to the ice shelf in a Twin Otter 3 days earlier, landing on skis at a temporary camp established by the Trust for the summer research season. The pilot was a New Zealander named Dave, who had been flying in Antarctica for 15 years, and he had pointed out the tent site as we descended, a tiny mark on the GPS that he had visited dozens of times but never approached on foot. Most people don't walk there, he told me as we unloaded my gear, his breath visible in the freezing air. It's 11 kilometers from the nearest safe landing zone, and the ice can be tricky. Crevasses, pressure ridges, the whole thing. But if you're determined to go, I'll pick you up in 3 days. Just make sure you're at the coordinates. I won't wait. I had nodded, shouldered my pack, and set out across the ice without looking back, the sound of the plane's engines fading behind me, until there was only the wind and the crunch of my boots on snow that had been falling for millennia. The first day of walking had been deceptively easy. The ice shelf was flat in this section, a vast plain of white that stretched to every horizon with no feature to break the monotony except the occasional pressure ridge or field of sastrugi. I walked for 6 hours, stopping every 90 minutes to eat and drink, my body moving in the rhythm I had learned from years of polar travel. The cold was intense but manageable, my modern clothing, synthetic layers designed in laboratories for exactly these conditions, keeping me warm in a way that Scott's men could never have imagined. I had a GPS, a satellite phone, emergency rations that would keep me alive for weeks, and the knowledge that rescue was possible if something went wrong. Scott's men had had none of these things. They had had wool and leather and canvas, and they had had each other, and they had had a slowly dwindling supply of food that had been carefully rationed from the beginning, but was never enough for the journey they had undertaken. I camped on the first night in a modern tent that could withstand winds of 100 kilometers per hour, that had a floor insulated against the cold of the ice, that could be erected in 5 minutes by one person working alone. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind outside, and I thought about the tent that waited for me 11 kilometers ahead, the replica that had been built to the exact specifications of the original, the canvas walls that would have flapped and rattled in this same wind, the floor that would have been nothing more than the ice itself, the men who would have huddled together for warmth in a space barely large enough for 5 bodies. I fell asleep thinking about them, and I dreamed of footsteps in the snow, of voices carried on the wind, of a darkness so complete that it seemed to have weight and texture and intention. I found the tent on the morning of the second day, after walking for 4 hours across ice that had become increasingly rough, the surface broken by pressure ridges and drifted snow that made every step an effort. The replica stood alone on a small rise, surrounded by nothing but white in every direction, a dark rectangle that seemed almost impossibly small against the scale of the landscape. I approached it slowly, my breath visible in the still air, my heart beating faster than the exertion warranted. There was a flagpole nearby, flying the Union Jack that Scott's men had carried with them to the pole and back, the fabric snapping in a wind that had been blowing across this ice shelf since before human beings existed. I stopped at the flagpole and touched the fabric, feeling the cold of the metal pole, the vibration of the flag in the wind, and I looked at the tent and I felt afraid. I do not know why I was afraid. I had been in more dangerous places, in more extreme conditions, in situations where my life had genuinely been at risk. But there was something about this tent, this small structure in the middle of an emptiness that seemed to have no end, that made me want to turn around and walk back to the landing zone and wait for Dave's plane and never think about this place again. It was not the cold, though the cold was intense. It was not the isolation, though I had not seen another human being since the plane had left. It was something else, something that I can only describe as the weight of presence, the sense that this place was not empty, that something remained here that could not be seen or heard or measured, but that was as real as the ice beneath my feet. I crawled inside the tent through the small entrance, the canvas stiff with cold, and I sat in the darkness, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light that filtered through the fabric. The interior was exactly as the original would have been. A rectangular space roughly 3 meters by 2, with a canvas floor that lay directly on the ice, walls that sloped inward to a central ridge, and a single small vent at the top that allowed some air to circulate while keeping the worst of the wind at bay. There were 5 sleeping bags arranged along the walls, replicas of the reindeer fur bags that Scott's men had used, and in the center was a small stove, a reproduction of the primus burner that had been their only source of heat, their only means of melting ice for water, their only defense against the cold that pressed against the canvas from every side. I sat cross-legged on the floor, my modern clothing suddenly feeling inadequate, my synthetic layers seeming thin and fragile against the reality of what this place was. And then I did something that I had not planned to do. I lay down in one of the sleeping bags, pulling the fur up to my chin, and I closed my eyes. The wind outside was a constant, moaning presence that seemed to carry voices from the past. A sound that was not quite human, but not quite natural either. A sound that seemed to be the ice itself speaking, the wind itself remembering, the cold itself telling stories that had been frozen into the landscape a century before. I lay there for a long time, not sleeping, not thinking, just listening, and I imagined the sound of their breathing, the rustle of their sleeping bags, the quiet conversations about rescue parties would never arrive. I thought about Oates first, because his story was the one that had always affected me most deeply. Captain Lawrence Oates, the soldier who had walked out into the blizzard on March 17, 1912, leaving the tent with the words, "I am just going outside, maybe some time." He had known that he was walking to his death. His feet were frostbitten, gangrenous, useless for walking, and he was slowing the others down at a time when speed was the only thing that could have saved them. The mathematics of survival in the Antarctic are brutal and unforgiving. The weakest must be sacrificed so that the stronger have a chance, however slim, of reaching safety. Oates had understood this. He had accepted it. He had walked out into the blizzard without complaint, without drama, without any gesture that would have made his death easier for the others to bear. And he had never returned. His body was never found. The ice and the wind had taken him, had covered him, had erased him from the landscape as if he had never existed. I lay in the sleeping bag, and I thought about his last moments, about the cold that would have enveloped him, about the darkness that would have closed in as his body temperature dropped, about the final thought that would have passed through his mind before consciousness faded. And I wept, there in the darkness of the tent, for a man who had died a century before I was born, who had made a choice that I could not imagine making, who had walked into the ice with a courage that I could not comprehend. I thought about Scott next, the leader who had written the final entry in his journal with a hand too cold to hold the pen properly, whose mind had been clouded by starvation and hypothermia and the knowledge that death was waiting just outside the canvas walls. "We shall stick it out to the end," he had written, "but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more." I had read those words 100 times before I came to Antarctica, had studied them in warm rooms with hot coffee, and the comfort of knowing that I was safe, that the cold was outside, that the ice was a story and not a reality. But lying in that tent, listening to the wind that had been the last sound Scott heard, feeling the cold that had been the last sensation he felt, I understood something that no amount of reading could have taught me. The end was not a moment of drama or revelation or transcendence. The end was simply the end, the gradual fading of warmth and consciousness and hope, the slow surrender to a cold that did not care about courage or determination or the British Empire. The end was silence and ice and the wind that would continue to blow long after the last human thought had faded into nothing. I thought about Wilson, the doctor and scientist, who had continued to collect specimens even as he weakened, who had carried geological samples on his sledge until the final days, who had believed that the knowledge they were gathering was worth more than their lives. I thought about Bowers, the navigator who had walked to the pole and back without complaint, who had shared the last of his food, who had lain in this tent or one like it and watched his companions die one by one. I thought about Evans, the strongest man in the party who had died first, his body broken by the physical demands of pulling a sledge across ice that offered no purchase, no rest, no mercy. I thought about them all, these 5 men who had huddled together in a space barely large enough for their bodies, who had shared their last warmth, their last food, their last hope, who had died not as heroes or martyrs, but as human beings, flawed and frightened and brave and desperate, in a place that did not care about any of it. The wind outside intensified, and I felt the tent shift slightly, the canvas walls pressing inward as the gusts found the gaps in the structure, the cold seeping through the fabric, in a way that my modern tent had never allowed. I opened my eyes and looked at the interior of the tent, at the sleeping bags, the stove, the small space that had contained an entire universe of courage and desperation, and the terrible mathematics of survival in a place that offers no mercy. The tent was a small thing, barely large enough for 5 men, but it contained more than canvas and poles and fur. It contained the last moments of human lives, the final conversations, the last breaths, the silence that had fallen when the last of them had stopped breathing, and the wind had continued to blow across an empty space that had once held everything they had been. I crawled out of the sleeping bag and sat up, my body stiff from the cold, my face numb where the wind had found the gaps in the canvas. I lit a small candle that I had brought with me, and the flame flickered in the draught, casting shadows on the walls that seemed to move like living things. I watched the flame for a long time, thinking about the candles that Scott's men would have used, about the seal oil lamps that had been their only light in the long Antarctic nights, about the way that light must have seemed precious and fragile in a world of darkness and cold. The candle burned down slowly, the wax dripping onto the canvas floor, and I thought about time, about the way that a century could pass and leave almost no trace on this landscape, about the way that human lives were brief and bright and then gone, while the ice continued its slow, patient movement across the continent. I spent the night in the tent, not sleeping but not fully awake either, suspended in a state of consciousness that seemed to blur the boundaries between past and present, between the men who had died here and the man who had come to understand them. The wind never stopped, a constant moaning that seemed to carry fragments of voices, snatches of conversation, the echoes of footsteps that had long since been erased by snow and time. I heard things that I knew were not real, the sound of a sledge being dragged across ice, the creak of leather harnesses, the soft thud of a body collapsing into snow. I heard the voice of Oates, calm and measured, saying his final words. I heard Scott, his voice weak and fading, dictating the last entry of his journal. I heard Wilson, his scientific curiosity undimmed even in death, describing the geological samples they had collected. And I heard the wind, always the wind, drowning out the voices and carrying them away into the darkness that had no end. In the morning, the wind had dropped to a whisper, and the light that filtered through the canvas was the pale, diffuse glow of an Antarctic dawn that would last for hours before the sun rose fully above the horizon. I crawled out of the tent and stood in the snow, my body aching from the cold, my mind clearer than it had been in months. The landscape was unchanged, the white wilderness stretching to every horizon, the flag snapping in the residual wind, the tent a small dark shape against the vastness of the ice. I looked at it for a long time, and I felt something that I had not felt the day before. It was not fear anymore, it was not sadness, though sadness was still there, a weight in my chest that would never fully lift. It was understanding, a recognition that this place was not a monument to human failure or human courage, but simply a place where human beings had lived and died, where they had made choices and suffered consequences, where they had been exactly as brave and as flawed and as human as any of us would be in the same circumstances. I packed my gear and began the walk back to the landing zone, my footsteps crunching in the snow that had been falling for a century and would continue to fall for centuries more. I did not look back at the tent, but I carried it with me, the memory of the darkness and the wind and the voices that had spoken to me from a place beyond time. I understood, finally, why these men had mattered, why their story had endured for 100 years while countless of the stories of courage and sacrifice had been forgotten. It was not because they had reached the pole, or because they had died, or because they had written journals that would be read by generations. It was because they had been human, completely and unflinchingly human, in a place that demanded everything they had and gave nothing in return. They had not been heroes, they had not been fools, they had been men who had walked into the ice because they believed that something mattered more than survival, and they had discovered, in the final days of their lives, that the ice does not care about belief. The ice simply waits, and it had waited for them, and it would wait for me, and it would wait for every human being who ever dared to venture into the silence that has no end. I reached the landing zone in the late afternoon, my body exhausted, my mind empty of everything except the memory of the tent and the men who had died in it. Dave's plane arrived on schedule, the skis touching down on the ice with a sound that seemed almost violent after the silence of the ice shelf. I climbed aboard and strapped myself in, and as the plane lifted off and the tent became a small dark speck on the white landscape below, I pressed my forehead against the cold window and I watched it disappear. I knew that I would never return to that place. Some experiences are meant to be had once, to be carried inside us for the rest of our lives, to shape us in ways that we cannot predict or control. The canvas that held their last breath had taught me something that I could not have learned anywhere else, something about the limits of human endurance and the infinite patience of the ice, about the courage that it takes to face death with dignity and the humility that comes from understanding that the world does not care about our stories. I carried that lesson with me as the plane climbed into the pale Antarctic sky, and I carry it still, a weight in my heart that is lighter than it sounds, a memory of darkness and wind, and the voices of men who walked into the ice and never returned, leaving behind only a tent, a journal, and a silence that will outlast everything we have ever been. Aunt Patricia had always treated family meetings like courtroom proceedings, and I was usually the defendant. I would sit at the far end of whatever table she'd chosen, the polished mahogany at her house, or the white linen at the country club, and I would feel her eyes on me before she even began speaking, a weight of judgment that had been there since I was old enough to understand that I was different from the grandchildren she favored. At 36, I was the only grandchild without children, without a husband, without the conventional markers of stability she valued. My cousins had married in their 20s, produced babies with the efficiency of people who understood the assignment, bought houses in the right neighborhoods, and joined the right clubs, and sent Christmas cards that Patricia displayed on her mantle like trophies. I had changed careers twice, moving from teaching to non-profit work to a small consulting business that paid my bills but would never impress anyone at a dinner party. I had lived in 3 cities, following opportunities and relationships, and the vague pull of something I couldn't name, each move catalogued by Patricia as further evidence of my unseriousness. I had dated someone she disapproved of, a woman with tattoos and a motorcycle and a laugh that filled rooms, and though that relationship had ended years ago, Patricia still brought it up at gatherings, a cautionary tale she told with the satisfaction of someone who had predicted disaster. When my grandfather established the family trust, he'd included a provision that each grandchild receive equal shares of the vacation properties upon reaching 35, a milestone I'd passed 6 months before the meeting where Patricia announced adjustments. The word hung in the air of the private dining room, sanitized and bureaucratic, and I watched her arrange her papers with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment. She cited my unstable lifestyle with the same tone she used for weather reports, factual and dismissive, as if my entire existence could be reduced to a series of poor choices that justified her intervention. She spoke of protecting the family legacy, of ensuring that the properties would be preserved for future generations, of her duty as trustee to make difficult decisions for the greater good. The greater good, it became clear, did not include me. The vote was unanimous among the adults present, my own father abstaining with a shrug that said more than any words, a gesture of surrender that I recognized from my entire childhood, from every moment when choosing me would have required him to stand against the force of Patricia's will. My mother had died when I was 12, and in the years since, my father had perfected the art of non-confrontation, of disappearing into his golf game and his television shows, and his careful avoidance of any conflict that might require him to choose a side. I left the country club through the service entrance, too humiliated to face the valet who'd parked my 10-year-old car among their luxury vehicles, too aware of the disparity between my life and theirs, to endure even the transactional politeness of someone opening my door. The service corridor smelled of industrial cleaner and old grease, a reality that existed behind the polished facade Patricia maintained, and I walked it with a steadiness I didn't feel, my heels clicking on the concrete in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I drove to my grandfather's smallest cottage, the one Patricia considered too rustic for proper use, too far from the beach, too lacking in the amenities that made the other properties suitable for entertaining. It sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by scrub pine and salt marsh, and I'd always loved it best, had begged to stay there as a child, when the other grandchildren preferred the larger house with the pool and the game room. My grandfather had understood, had given me the key without comment, had sat with me on the porch in the evenings, while the others played cards inside. I spent that night in the cottage, sleeping on the same mattress where I'd cried at 12 over a bad report card, the same mattress where my grandfather had found me and sat beside me without speaking until I was ready to talk. The room smelled of cedar and salt, of time passing slowly, of a life lived without the urgency that Patricia demanded. I lay awake for hours, listening to the wind in the pines, feeling the humiliation settle into something harder and more permanent. I thought about calling my father, about demanding an explanation for his shrug, about asking why my survival of my mother's death, my resilience in building a life without her, my devotion to his own father in his final years, counted for less than Patricia's performance of competence. I didn't call. I knew what he would say, the same things he'd always said, about not making waves, about family peace, about how Patricia meant well even when her methods were harsh. I had heard those words too many times to believe them anymore, but I had also heard them too many times to expect anything different. In the morning, I found his journals in a cedar chest, the one I'd helped him move from the attic when I was 16, The one he'd told me contained old papers that I shouldn't worry about. They were 40 years of property records, tenant complaints, and handwritten notes about each grandchild's visits, bound in leather that had softened with age and use. I opened the first one with hands that shook, and I read my grandfather's careful script describing a world I'd only partially known, a world of maintenance and management, and the quiet work of preserving something worth having. My name appeared more than any other. He'd written about my patience with the old plumbing, how I'd stayed up until 2 in the morning during a storm to bail the flooded basement while my cousins slept in the main house, how I'd refused to wake anyone because they needed their rest and she never minded the work. He'd written about my willingness to paint the porch when no one else volunteered, how I'd done it in August heat without complaint, how the paint had lasted 12 years because I'd prepared the wood properly instead of rushing to finish. He'd written about the way I sat with him during his final summer when the others were too busy, how I'd read him the newspaper and brought him coffee and listened to stories he'd told 100 times without once letting him know I'd heard them before. I read for hours, sitting on the same porch where he'd written many of these entries, the salt air moving through the screens, the sound of the marsh birds rising and falling with the tide. I found the entry from the week before he died, the one where he'd written about changing the trust provisions, about ensuring that each grandchild would receive equal shares regardless of Patricia's opinions, about his hope that the properties would teach us responsibility rather than entitlement. He'd written my name last, a postscript that filled the final page. She understands what these places mean. She doesn't need to own them to care for them, but she deserves to know that I saw her. I saw what she did when no one was watching. I saw who she became when no one was looking. I closed the journal and sat with it in my lap, feeling the weight of his witness, the validation I'd been seeking from a family that had never learned to see me. I hired an estate attorney who specialized in trust litigation, funded the retainer with the savings Patricia had called irresponsible, the account I'd built through careful budgeting, and the occasional windfall from my consulting work. The attorney was a woman named Diane, older than me by 2 decades. With grey hair she didn't dye, and a courtroom presence that made opposing counsel visibly nervous. She listened to my story without interrupting, reviewed the journals and the trust documents, and the financial records I'd gathered from public filings, and she told me that Patricia had likely breached her fiduciary duty in ways that went far beyond my removal. The self-dealing was extensive, properties leased to friends at below market rates, maintenance contracts awarded to companies Patricia owned through intermediaries, rental income diverted to accounts that didn't appear on any trust disclosure. Patricia had been systematic, careful, confident that no one would challenge her because no one ever had. 18 months later, a judge ruled that Patricia had breached her fiduciary duty through self-dealing and misrepresentation, the language formal and devastating, the consequences cascading through the family structure that Patricia had built and controlled. The properties were placed under independent management, a neutral third party that reported to all beneficiaries equally, and I was named the beneficiary of the smallest but most significant cottage, the one with my grandfather's journals, his tools, and the view he loved best. The ruling didn't restore everything Patricia had taken, didn't undo the years of her control, or the relationships she'd poisoned with her narrative of my unworthiness. But it gave me the place that mattered most, the place where I had been seen, the place where I could continue the work my grandfather had begun. Patricia's children still vacation at the larger homes, paying market rates to the trust, their entitlement finally constrained by the same rules they'd used to exclude me. I see them sometimes, in the distance, on the beach or at the dock, and I feel nothing more than a distant curiosity, the same emotion you might feel for characters in a novel you've finished reading. They don't acknowledge me, and I don't seek their acknowledgement. The relationship we might have had, the cousinhood of shared summers and family holidays, was sacrificed to Patricia's ambition long before I understood what was being taken from me. I don't mourn it anymore. I have something else now, something I built myself from the materials my grandfather left behind. I live in my cottage year-round now, restoring it slowly, replacing the shingles that have weathered too long, repairing the porch where I first learned to use a hammer, preserving the journals in archival boxes that will outlast me. I host the cousins who were too young to vote against me and old enough to see what happened, the ones who grew up hearing Patricia's version of my story and have begun to question it as they watch me work. They come for weekends, bringing groceries and helping with projects, and we sit on the porch in the evenings talking about their lives, their struggles, their growing awareness that family can be both sanctuary and trap. I don't recruit them to my side, don't tell them what to think about what happened. I simply live my life openly, let them draw their own conclusions, Trust that the truth is visible to anyone who chooses to look. My father visits sometimes, awkward and apologetic, bringing wine he can't afford, the cheap bottles from the grocery store that he selects with the same care he applies to everything, as if intention can compensate for means. I pour it and listen to him talk about his golf game, his latest score, his plans for retirement that never quite materialize. He doesn't mention Patricia, doesn't explain his shrug at the country club, doesn't offer the apology I stopped expecting years ago. I don't invite him to stay. The door my aunt closed taught me which ones I can open myself, which relationships are worth the energy of maintenance, and which are best left to their own slow decay. My father is not a bad man, just a weak one, and I have learned that weakness can cause as much damage as malice, that the absence of choice is itself a choice. I wake early now, before the sun rises over the marsh, and I make coffee in the same percolator my grandfather used, the one that takes 20 minutes and produces something stronger than anything from a modern machine. I sit on the porch and watch the light change, the same view my grandfather described in his journals, the same birds, the same tide, the same slow turning of the world that doesn't care about family trusts or courtroom victories. I think about him sometimes, about what he would think of my life now, about whether he would be proud of the legal battle or disappointed that it was necessary. I believe he would understand both, would recognize the necessity of fighting for what matters while mourning that the fight was required at all. The cottage needs constant attention. The work of preservation that my grandfather taught me is never finished, and I give it that attention gladly. I paint the porch when it needs painting, repair the roof when it leaks, clear the drains when they clog, and in each task I feel his presence, his approval, his witness of who I am when no one is watching. The journals sit in the cedar chest, accessible but protected, and I read them sometimes, not for the legal evidence they provided, but for the voice of the only person in my family who saw me clearly and chose to record what he saw. That record is my inheritance, more valuable than any property, more lasting than any trust provision, more real than any performance of family that Patricia could orchestrate. The cousins who visit have started bringing their own children, small people who run on the beach and catch crabs in the marsh and ask me questions about the grandfather they never knew. I tell them stories from the journals, show them the tools he used, let them help with small tasks that make them feel important and capable. I watch them grow, these children of a family that tried to erase me, and I see in their faces the possibility of something different, a future where the legacy is care rather than control, presence rather than performance, love that doesn't require conformity as its price. I don't know if that future will happen. I know only that I am here, in this cottage, doing this work, opening the doors that I choose to open, and keeping closed the ones that lead back to a version of myself I no longer am. The salt air has weathered my face, softened the lines that grief and struggle carved, replaced them with something that looks like peace even on days when I don't feel peaceful. I am 38 now, 2 years past the meeting that changed everything, and the life I've built is smaller than Patricia's vision of success, but larger than anything I could have imagined when I was sitting at the end of her table, waiting for the verdict she had already decided. The cottage is enough. The work is enough. The witness of my grandfather's journals, the trust of the cousins who choose to visit, the quiet mornings with coffee and birdsong and the slow turning of the tide, all of it is enough. The door my aunt closed was not the only door, was never the only door, and I have learned to build my own entrances, to create my own thresholds, to welcome the people who see me as I am and let the rest pass by without demanding they stop. That, finally, is the legacy I reclaimed, not the property, not the legal victory, but the knowledge that I was always enough, that my grandfather saw it, that I have finally learned to see it myself.